All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on the final day. Even though you all got an email last night saying this was already over, thanks for ignoring it and coming anyways. My name is John Levesque. I am a senior PM on the Flow team. I focus on the areas of evangelism, engagement, and community. I'm joined by one of our engineering managers, David. David, tell everybody about yourself.
Yeah, like John mentioned, I'm an engineering manager for Flow, one of four. I focus on Flow's partnership with other Microsoft services and embedding capabilities, so Flow within Teams, PowerApps, SharePoint, and so forth.
All right, and so this is an interesting session. It's called Advanced Workflow, but they marked it 200. And so some of you may be here for something a little more intermediate. Some of you may have come for the title Advanced, so I want to do a quick level set. Who here is already quite familiar with Flow? Okay, about half. Who is not familiar with Flow? Okay, a few. All right, cool. So we're going to do some quick level setting to give you guys an introduction. And just as a heads up, David's going to be getting into some advanced techniques here. So you may see some things that are slightly above your head now. But if you stay with us till the end, we'll get you some resources that'll get you started and get you plugged in and get you on your journey so that this stuff won't always be so foreign to you. So let's jump in. Let's talk about introduction. So first, we have to talk about the types of flows that we have. We have several types of triggers, which kind of defines what type of flow that is. The first is scheduled, where I can say every day at 6 a.m., run this flow. Every week on Tuesday, run that flow. Every 30 days, run this other one. We also have instant flows at the press of a button, either on my mobile device or a physical button in real life. I press that button, it kicks off a flow, and a series of actions happen. Also, the flows that you guys are familiar with, for those of you who said you're familiar with Flow, we call those automated flows. Automated flows start with any various trigger and then have a set of actions, typical with what you're used to building. Also, today, if we have time at the end, hopefully, we're going to also talk about business process flows, which are much more task-oriented types of flows. Okay, so let's talk about actions real quick. They are the 1+ steps that run after any trigger. Good thing to know about actions is you can actually connect to on-premise data gateways if you have on-prem data. They support SQL, SharePoint, file server, Oracle, and something else I can't remember at the moment. Look it up. Also, you can directly connect to other services using the HTTP endpoint. If there is a RESTful API out there that you want to call directly and not wrap a connector around, you can use the HTTP connector to do your get and post actions straight out of the box. Flow also has connectors that might not even connect to a service. They just do conversion or data manipulation. So we have date-time conversion, we have compose actions, we have select and join and union, and a bunch of things that you're going to see today that aren't actually tied to any service. Finally, already mentioned, you can connect to your own service via REST. We have this concept of custom connectors. So if you have a RESTful API service, you can wrap that with what we call a Swagger, and Flow can then consume your service just like any of the others that we have. Now, this is an important concept, especially for those of you guys that are not familiar with Flow. We have a concept called dynamic content or flowing data. And what happens is, as we add steps into our flow, the data from those steps becomes available in all of the subsequent steps. And so when we see here, we add a trigger, we have the outputs file name, size, and file content. But then I would add another action, and I would get additional fields like title and count. And so now in my third step, I would see that all of my data from the previous two steps is available to me in my lower steps for use so that I don't have to be retyping things over and over and over again. Okay, data types and expressions.
First, I'm going to show a demo just to set some expectations for later, and we're going to build on the flow that I show right now as we introduce new concepts. Switch over. Okay, so this is a basic flow. 4 steps, not that complicated. What does it do? So this is actually similar to topics that I've talked about with people who came up to the booth who want to know how to do something. So I want a daily digest of open support cases. So I'm using the recurrence trigger set once a day.
It's that schedule we talked about.
Yes, scheduled flows. So next, I'm going to grab records out of my CDS instance. So CDS is the Common Data Service. It's the platform underlying Dynamics, PowerApps, Flow. You can use entities that may have been defined by Dynamics or other ISVs, or you can build your own entities. So I have an entity called support cases. I'm going to pull data from there, and I'm going to use the built-in create HTML table to package this up into something that I can send myself in an email. So this action out of the box supports selecting which columns I want. So I can reference from the dynamic content the fields off of the entity that I want to show and the header title. Then I can send an email using the Outlook connector. I'm just going to send it to myself, and I can reference the output of that action, create an HTML table. So if I switch over to the result of that, I get a fairly basic HTML table. Yes. So we're going to build on this as we go forward to make this a little bit more usable.
So we can see there David has a trigger and then 3 actions, right? His first action he put in is to get his records out of CDS. The next action was to create a table. He's able to insert dynamic content from his previous steps into his lower steps, so it's nice and simple and he doesn't have to do any typing. His final step was to add an email, drop the output of that HTML table into it, and then David, go ahead and pull up the email one more time just so we can give it one good look and see what it looks like. So this is what it comes to us straight out of the box. Oh, where'd it go?
I'm going to show it side by side with the actions we can see.
Perfect. And so this is
the headers.
Go ahead.
All of the headers that I defined and the values come out, and you can see that I had 6 rows in this particular entity, so I get 6 rows in my table.
Perfect. All right, so now that you've gotten an idea of how a basic flow is formed and how those steps kind of flow together and what a basic output looks like, what we're going to do is continue to talk about the different types of expressions in Flow and what they do, and then David's going to continuously demo and add on as we learn about those things so that we can actually make this a useful piece of information for ourselves.
All right, so as John introduced, I'm going to talk about data types and expressions. So there are many reasons that you would need to do this, where you don't have the fields you want necessarily coming right out of an action, so you need to do some conversions. So you want to convert types. Maybe you want to parse out the year of a date time, and now that's a string, so you now need to convert that to an integer so you can use it with some math. Maybe you want to add numbers to the day of the month. Other cases, you want to perform simple inline calculations. So you need to do a quick conversion or multiplication. It could be mathematical or it could just be concatenation of 2 strings together. Other cases are generating data. So maybe you are writing files into SharePoint and you want to differentiate them by a timestamp, or you want to GUID or a random number so that you don't run into conflicts. So we have expressions for that, and you can use them directly from within the Flow Designer. So optional values. So what are those? That would be a case of your SharePoint list doesn't have some columns populated, and you need to handle that in your flow. Maybe you need to take a different path or look up the default approver if the approver column isn't set on your item.
I think one thing to mention with optional values is sometimes when you're building a flow, they may not be available to you. You're going to have to look for this little gray button called See More. Those optional values will be hidden under there, and if you miss that, you could miss them. So keep an eye out for See More.
All right. And finally, the if conditional statements in control flow. So that's now based on data coming out of your action. You want to take one of 2 different paths. You can write an expression either in the condition card, or you can switch into advanced mode and write a more complicated expression. And working with lists. So some actions will return multiple objects, and now you maybe need to loop over them, find something within them. You can use expressions to do that. So how do we create expressions? So we saw in the designer that add dynamic content appears in the cards. There's also an expression tab. So if you switch over to that, that's where you can enter your expressions. You get autocomplete. You can see lists of available methods. You get some basic documentation in there to see what the parameters take. And then once you click OK, that gets replaced as a token in line in the designer card, the same way that one of the outputs would be visible. In this particular action, I see a preview that I'm using the replace function. So For those of you who may not be familiar with programming or scripting or Excel macros or anything like that, let's break down the expression. So we said the expression name is replace. That's the function that we're going to call. We use parameters. The parameters are what we pass to the function, and we use parentheses to surround those. Functions take 0 or more parameters. Actually, we said 1 here. In this case, the replace function takes 3. We use single quotes around static text. And it's important to note that expressions can be nested. So you can have the parameter to one expression can be another expression, and so forth. All right, a few important expressions before we dive further into building them yourself. So what happens when you click on an output in an action? Well, the Logic Apps designer that Flow is using is actually embedding an expression. It's just a shortcut to get to a particular expression. So if we start talking about building our own, we need to have a way of doing the same sort of thing that Logic Apps was going to do when we wanted to reference a particular output. So the body expression is the way you get to outputs of a previous action in the flow. The step name is the step name in the designer with spaces converted to underscores. Trigger body is a shortcut for the trigger. So anything that came out of the trigger, whether it was when an email is received or when an item is updated, you can get those fields there. Item is useful, and we're going to talk more about loops and arrays later, but item is useful for when you're in the context of one of those loops and you want to reference the item that you're currently processing. It's also useful when you are using an action that takes an array as input and does something on each of the elements itself. You can use this to reference each that property. And variables, again, we'll talk about variables later, but it's a way of storing some data off for later use, and we have an expression to be able to access that. So one trick, and I'll show this the next time I pull up the demo computer, is if you're unsure of how Logic Apps is actually referencing something, you can always hover over the token in the designer view, and the tooltip will pop up, and it will show you the expression that is embedded in there. And so that's one way of seeing how it's doing it so that you can then build it into your own expression. Data types and formats. I made some references to that earlier. So strings, that's text. So we use that a lot. Just a sentence, that is a string. Maps exactly to SharePoint text columns. Emails, URLs, phone numbers, even date times can be represented as strings as well, and we have a few more of the advanced data formats for base64 and binary content, maybe where you're accepting a file as input to the flow, or the file has been added to a SharePoint site, and data URIs and URI components. In terms of non-text formats, we have floating point numbers, so decimal values, integer numbers, booleans, true, false, and then arrays, so that's a collection of a type of object, so you have multiple entries, or an object that has multiple sub-properties on it. And you can also have arrays of any of those types, arrays of objects as well. And then one important note is that strings aren't necessarily interchangeable for other data types. So the string true surrounded by quotes is not the same thing as the Boolean expression true. There is some content conversion automatically that the designer will do if you take an integer and pass it into a string field. That will be handled implicitly. In some cases, the designer will do this for you. So it knows that you're taking a file output and taking that into the body of something else, and it will convert that to base64, for example. And then other cases, you will need to do the conversion yourself. So the case that I mentioned before, maybe you want to pull out the month or the day out of a date time. You can extract that, but you will need to then convert that to an integer.
You guys tracking with us so far? Good? All right, good.
Okay, so there's an if expression, and some of you who may have built flows had already discovered the condition card, which is itself also kind of like an if. With the condition card, you get a yes branch or a no branch, or true branch or a false branch, if you think of it that way. If is an expression that lets you do that calculation in line where you need the expression to evaluate to a particular value. So I think one way of thinking about it is if you want to actually take a different path in your flow, if something do this one set of steps, If something else, do a completely different set of steps, or maybe end the flow, use the condition. If you just want to make a quick decision about a value, use the if expression. So it takes 3 inputs. One is the expression to evaluate, and then there's a true value and a false value. And so based on that expression, how it evaluates, the full expression, the full if, will evaluate to one of those 2 second sets of parameters.
David just taught me about this with this slide. I didn't even know that if was a thing before we started practicing here.
So one other thing to note about this that bites everyone, I've been bitten by it, everybody's been bitten by it. The if doesn't short circuit. So, well, I'll say there's a caveat on top of the caveat. So the if generally doesn't short circuit. Don't depend on it. So basically that means if you know that an expression is going to evaluate to true, be prepared that the false case may be evaluated as well. And if you have properties that aren't present, you may get a flow error. We actually convinced the Logic Apps team to help us out with this because so many people were hitting it. They fixed it for that case. So if the expression results to true, it will just return the value directly. If the expression evaluates to false, the true expression may be evaluated and you may fail in your flow. So something to be aware of. All right, so handling optional values. We talked about that before. So this is cases where data is not present. So there's 2 ways to handle this. Sometimes you need both. Sometimes you only need one. So there's a question mark character. You can see that in the statement that I have at the bottom. The question mark character before accessing a property basically tells Flow this property may not be there. And therefore, other properties below that property may not be there as well. So you can use that so that you don't get a flow run failure saying that a property was not found. You will, however, get a null, and you need to handle that. So that's where coalesce comes in. Coalesce is a function that takes 2 parameters. If the first one evaluates to null, it will return the second value. So here we have an example of saying, look at the get record step, take the parent property off of that object, take the child property off of that object. Both of those may not be there, and that whole expression may be null. If that expression is null, then I want to use a default value. So you can use this to simplify a lot of logic in your flows. You don't have to branch with conditions, looking for data to be present, and having chained condition cards. You can combine this all into one expression, substitute in a default value, and have a much simpler flow.
It's one of my favorite things is stacking conditions, David. Come on.
No. The programmer in me is just
hates that.
Can't deal with that. Okay, well, before we get into arrays, I want to jump over to our demo again. And we're going to build up from the first flow that I showed you. Demo 2. Okay, so let's add some expressions. So if you look at our email that we first saw, well, okay, I have a case ID column that's some combination of letters and numbers, and I have this really long date timestamp with Z's for UTC, and I don't care about when the actual case was opened down to the minute and the second, but I want to know roughly when it was open. So how can I use expressions to simplify this and get a more usable email? Let me edit this. Okay, so now the flow is effectively the same, but I've added some expressions into the create HTML table step. Instead of adding columns directly in off of the entity into the ID and the opened table column, I'm going to add an expression. And you can see that I have a token that's giving me that preview of what I'm doing. So here I'm using the concat method. So I had the case number, but maybe my website has a way of looking that up by URL. So how can I make that more useful? So I can take the support.contoso.com, that's my website, and then I can concatenate, so take 2 strings and append them together, and I can take the ID field from my item. So notice that item expression that I referenced before, that's saying the create HTML table is going over every value that was passed in from the list of records, taking the ID field off of that and concatenating it after support.contoso.com. In the opened column, remember I didn't want the minutes and seconds, so I can use an expression here to format the date time. So again, item, taking the created on field, and the format date time is a expression that lets you, well, formatted date time. So it takes a format string. These are generally well-known standard values. So YYYY references the year. YY would mean just the last 2 digits of the year. These are all documented online, but to just show you a simple one, I have YYYY-MM capital for the month. Lowercase m would be the minute, and I don't want that, and DD for the day. So now my email looks a little bit better. We're getting there. So now I have a formatted link, although Outlook is not rendering it to be clickable, so I'm going to want to fix that. And now I've simplified my opened column to show just the year, month, and the day. All right, so arrays.
All right, so working with arrays. First of all, what are arrays? There's a few different classes of things you need. If you need to repeat an action over each list item, so if you need to iterate over each one to find a certain thing, an array can help you with that. Getting single items out of a list. Filtering lists down, or making lists work with different actions. And so David's going to show us a little bit of that in the next demo. But you can kind of see here, so filtering list information out, kind of arraying it all together, and producing new information is something we can do as well. We also have this apply to each concept. And so when you add something to the Flow editor that is contained in a list, oftentimes, actually all the time, if it's working properly, it will drop an apply to each on there for you and then add that step directly into it so that you don't have to know that I need an apply to each right here. Now, if you don't want that, there's a couple ways out of it. You get only one list item using expressions or filters, or you can convert the whole list to a string in the form of a list or a table, and that will help you get past that if you don't want the apply to each as well. And so now, David, getting certain list items.
All right, so in some cases you may want to pull out specific items out of your list. So we have expressions for that. First, not surprisingly, gets you the first element of the array, and similarly last will get you the last one. You can also use numeric indexes into the array. They're zero-based, like basically every programming language ever, to start at 0. So the first one is actually 0, the second one is actually 1, and so forth. If you are using strings, numbers, and booleans, you can use that item directly, taking last and passing that in. If it's an object, you then want to then chain on bracket operators to go access properties off of the object. So converting lists to strings. Join is an expression that you can use to take all strings and package them up together with a delimiter character. So maybe you have a list of email addresses and you want them to be semicolon delimited, so you can pass that into the to field to send an email, which is what it expects. So you can do a join, pass in your array, pass in a semicolon delimiter as a second parameter, and join those up together. So create HTML or CSV table. We saw that earlier in the demo. That will automatically package all of those objects together into an HTML table. It will, by default, take all properties of the objects and make a column for those. I was using the mode that lets you specify which columns you want. Select will let you, and we'll get into this in a second, take sub-properties. If you only want one field of an object in an array, let's say you have a people column in SharePoint, you only want the email address or the name, you can use select to pull out just that, and maybe that's what you then pass in to join. Filtering. So this is where we're going to get into demo 3. So ideally, you use always, for performance, for simplicity, the trigger or action filtering. So triggers often will let you specify a filter. Sometimes it's OData syntax. Other actions allow filtering as well. So get items and you pass in a filter.
And big announcement in filtering. Yesterday we just announced it in mine and Ken's session. We now have Power Query in Flow for filtering as well.
It's cool. Fresh news.
Fresh news.
All right, so it's still important to know how to filter arrays. In some cases, the OData syntax may not allow you to fully specify your filtering condition. or an action just doesn't support any filtering, and you're going to always get back more objects than you want, and you need to filter them yourself. That's where filter array comes in. So again, it takes an array as input, and it takes, much like a condition card, an expression. So a property, an operator, and another value. So you can, here we have job title contains manager, filtered off of an array of objects that came back from the Office 365 users connector. So that's going to evaluate that expression again, or that comparison against every item in the array, and give you a new array that comes out with only the items that passed that check. There are a couple shortcuts to filtering as well. If you only want some number of them, or you want to skip over a certain set of items in the array, you can use take or skip. So if anyone is a .NET developer using link, these are the exact same concept. These are also functional programming concepts. So they're here as well. So you can take a certain number or skip over a certain number. Transforming arrays. So these are other types of manipulation on arrays themselves. So select, that was what I was talking about. So here we have an example of selecting just the display name and mail value off of those user objects. So that will give me, I have an array of objects that go in, and I get an array of objects with just those two properties out. So it's one way of reducing a lot of noise, reducing properties that you don't care about. There's another mode where if you only want one property, you can click on the button that appears next to map, switch it over to a mode that lets you just specify one particular value. So that will give you an array of strings in this case. So if you want to then pass that into join, that's how you could easily reduce the data set down to an array of primitive objects like strings or booleans or whatever. And passing data into actions that themselves take arrays. So we talked about mostly arrays out from actions or triggers, but what about arrays in? So in this case, send an email exposes attachments. So that's an array. It's attachments. You can specify multiple. So one mode is static. So you know that there will always be two attachments. So in that case, you fill it out statically. You can add the attachment name, which can come from wherever you want in the flow, and then you will be able to add another attachment after you add that one and add the second item. If it's dynamic, then attachments, again, there's the toggle button next to it that you can switch it into the mode that lets you pass in an expression dynamically to say, my attachments array is coming from this other array that you have built up separately. And list containment. So sometimes you need to check if a particular value is in an array. Contains is how you do that. Union, this is a trick we'll see in a second, ordinarily takes two arrays and merges them together, but it also has the handy property that it will remove duplicates. So one way of getting through reducing an array down to only the distinct values is to use union. So let's do a couple demos on how to select and filter. All right, so here was our email at the end of the last demo. So we fixed our date times and links, but if you notice, I'm seeing a closed support case. Well, I don't care about seeing that on a daily basis. I only want to know about the open ones. I want to know what my team is working on. So what if I can filter that out and reduce the data set? So I'm going to use filter, as we saw earlier. So the rest of the flow is the same. I'm just going to modify the array that I end up passing into the HTML table. So instead of passing in the records, as you saw before, I'm going to pass in the output of the filter array. So how do I filter this array? I'm going to do a little bit of a trick. Instead of the state equals something or state not equals to something, I'm going to do a create array on the left side. So I only care about open and mitigated, so I will use create array to build up a set of values, open and mitigated. Then I'm going to use contains. So internally, it's the same expression contains that we saw earlier. And I'm going to say the case state. So what does this mean? This means for every item in that array, I want to know if the case state is open or mitigated. I've just flipped it around a little bit to show that A, that's possible, and B, this was a little bit easier to think about it. So then, like you saw, I pass in the filtered array, not the original array. and then send an email with the, again, output of the HTML table action. So if I switch over to 3, now that closed case disappears. Everything else is the same. All right, well, there's still some improvement to go. But before we get there, I want to talk about variables. So how many people have programming experience? Oh, perfect. Okay, so you know what variables are. Okay, then I'll, whatever. Then we don't even need to do this slide.
Nope. Skip it.
Skip. Save some time. And we don't have time. So I'm going to show the demo. So, all right. Just show demos. All right. This one gets a little bit more complicated, but hopefully no one runs screaming from the room. All right. So again, I am now filtering open and mitigated cases because that's what I want to see. Now I'm going to do that distinct trick that we talked about. So my final improvements that I want to do on this email is I want to see a table for each engineer that had cases assigned. So if you saw from the email, some people had 1 case assigned to them and 1 engineer had 2 cases. So I want to know if someone's getting overloaded. And I want to easily be able to spot that by the size of the table with their name. So I want to break apart that 1 table of support cases into multiple tables. So I'm going to need to do some looping for that, and I need to figure out how to break things apart by the engineer. So first step I'm going to do is get a second copy of just the engineer names. So again, I'm passing in the body of the get open and mitigated cases array, and I'm selecting just that single property, as we saw an example of on the slides, that I just want the engineer field. Now I'm going to initialize a variable for the HTML content of the email. So I talked about this exact example with someone on Sunday at the PowerApps app in a day. So instead of just passing in or specifying the HTML directly in the send an email action, I want to build up the body of it. And this is going to let me iterate over the cases, iterate over the engineers, build up the HTML I want, and then send the email. So initializing an empty string. Now I'm going to iterate over, and I don't want to reprocess engineers multiple times. I want to reprocess them once each. So I'm going to use that union trick that I mentioned earlier to union the array of engineers against itself, and now I'm going to get just 1 entry for each engineer. Now I'm inside of an apply to each. We talked about looping. So I'm going to process each one separately in this scope inside the apply to each card. I'm going to get the cases for the engineer. So now I'm going to filter the set again. Instead of looking for open, like I did before on the comparison, I want to look for the engineer equal to the item that I'm currently processing. I'm using item, the item expression, to do that comparison. Now I'm going to start a table. Like I said, I want a table for each engineer. So that's why I'm going to add their name, add an assigned to header, add the table header, and start the body tag. Loop over each case, build up a TR tag for each record. I'm doing the same exact expressions that we saw earlier when the create an HTML table action was doing this for myself. Build that up together, and then I'm going to close my table at the end of the loop. Then sending the email, remember to use the new HTML and not the old one, and we get a better looking email where now I can see that, okay, she has 2 cases assigned to her, everybody else has 1. So now my daily digest, which I spent 5 minutes building, just adding a few cards, now at least is solving more of my problems. I can see which engineers are overloaded, which ones need cases reassigned to others. All right.
All right, so we have about 10 minutes left, and I'm going to give you guys a choice. So we can either keep going on Flow here for a little bit and then try our best to get to business process flows, or we could change directions right now and talk a little bit about business process flows and show you how that works. Who do we want to go? Let's do a show of hands. So continue on flows. Switch to business process flows. All right, perfect.
All right, that's what
clear, very clear.
All right.
All right, so I got to jump ahead in my slides here a little. All right, so business processes, they're a little bit different than what you just saw in Flow. These are they have visual indicators that tell users where they are in a business process. They reduce the need for training because everything's outlined. When something gets to me and there's a task, I just have a checklist, so I don't ever have to go through training on this process. It's all outlined right in front of me as I'm doing it. Slides, sorry.
Slides.
Thank you for the call out. The rest of you guys were so quiet. Whoever you were, thank you for being brave and saying it. Okay, also, very configurable to support common line of business methodologies. As you can see in the little example there, there's a branch, and so we can customize that as much as we want for our processes. So what do business processes do? They create stages or screens that enforce a certain sequence of steps. So for instance, in the example, we're going to see a deck that's going through content and branding and legal review, and each of those teams has a different set of tasks or requirements that they have to be going through. For each stage, we either collect data or kick off automated flows, and then also we can create branching logic based on some of the data if we want to. So we've seen the two types of flows. You saw David working on, two types of business process flows. So we have the business process flows and then the task flows. And so the difference between the two is like the business process flows are kind of the default. Those are the ones that you're going to start using right out of the box. And then task flows are kind of your global entry for tasks, no matter where you are. And they're more focused on like one task instead of a list of tasks. So now what we have is the stages, which I said, and inside each of those stages are various tasks lists. Each of them show up in the UI. And then there's the two separate parts, which are data inputs and then CDS workflows. Let's go here, task flows. Let's go ahead and just jump into the demo and show you what it looks like. Okay, so this is the BPF view. And so what you can see here is, so I'm the admin, so I get every view. I can see content, and it's in branding right now, in legal, and then final. If I was in the branding team, it would just come to me, and I would see the branding stage. And so what you can see here is branding has some things that they need to do. I'm going to make this a little bigger. And so they have to go through this checklist when they look at this deck. And so they have to look at, is the content branded? Well, let's go and take a look here. Yeah, it's got plenty of lorem ipsum branding. I think that's perfect. So we're going to say, yes, it's branded. Are the logos distorted? No, they look pretty good. Check for trademarks. I saw them. And it's great. And then, boom, next stage. Now what happens is the person in legal would get a notification in their email that this business process was now waiting on their review. And so as you can see, it's a little bit different than how flows work. That top-down methodology that we use in Flow, it's a little bit different where we're actually forcing tasks inside of a process here. And so now let's kind of go look at how this is made. So when you go into the Flow portal, BPFs are present there. You'll see the My Flows, Team Flows, and now Business Process Flows. One thing to note is you will need a P2 plan for every user to use BPF. It is a premium feature, and it will be required for every single user. And so if you go there without a P2 plan, it would probably say right here, sorry, you don't have this enabled. When you get your P2 plan, you could create your database and be able to use it. So now, once I'm here, I would click my edit button on my document review, and then it brings up the BPF editor. And so you can see I have my various stages here. I have my review content stage. If I click that open, inside of that, I have all my steps that user must follow. Now, if I want to just add another step, I could just quickly drag this over right here and say, does it have profanity? That'd probably be covered under grammar, but just an idea to show you how easy it is to add a step in, right? Okay, and so each stage has its different tasks here, and it's very easy to manage those. And then if you want to add some conditional logic, that's available as well. But I want to try and cut this quick so we have time for questions. We have 5 minutes left. And so I'm going to actually go ahead and just end that right there. Quick touch on it so you guys could see it. You know that you need P2. I would love to open up the floor to questions, and if you have them, please come up to the microphones. Otherwise, thank you guys so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. That's what we have for you today. Want to go to the mic?
Use a mic? Yeah.
Oh, can we get the mic in the middle? Nope. Try it again.
We'll repeat the question.
I'll repeat it. Go ahead. Yep. So the question is, if your if has a true in it, is that the same as a switch case?
I don't see them as being the same. I think there's different purposes. One is more for you want to do a comparison and choose between two values. Switch is more about that branching. So switch is more similar to the condition card that gives you a path. Switch is going to break out the flow, and you're going to have a path for each particular case. You can merge that again later, but it does sort of branch the control flow of the process out, where you would do something different for each case. There could be one or more actions versus like picking a value directly.
The easiest way to put it is like if is just if then else, right? Whereas everything else has more.
Like in one spot, in one expression.
Right.
Yeah.
Over there?
Yes. Is there a way to have a variable or an object persist through runs of flows so that you can actually store an object and refer to it on the next run?
Now that's advanced. We, not directly in Flow, we typically use CDS or SharePoint or SQL for something like that to persist, because there isn't anything that,
Just write something out to that CD.
Yeah, write that
with back to it next time you run.
Yep.
Down here? Can't hear you, sorry. The question is it possible to integrate business process flows with SharePoint and CDS? And I believe you can bring your SharePoint data into CDS and then leverage it that way. But as far as using SharePoint directly in BPF, I don't think so.
You're talking about running the BPF from SharePoint? Sorry. Walking through the stages of the BPF from SharePoint?
Yeah.
Oh.
Like Dynamics, you show the process, step by step.
Gotcha. Yeah. No, you would have to bring your SharePoint data into CDS, and then you would do it on top of CDS.
Just externally for walking through that. Yeah.
Correct.
Thanks.
What is the best practice to create a task and wait for a task to be completed? What is the best practice in Flow?
I'm not sure I understand.
Subjective. What are you using for task management?
To another
To a
task in my Flow and wait for the task to be completed.
So approvals are commonly used for that. We're shipping custom response options, so you won't be boxed in to approve and reject. That you could just have a task that says, I need you to go do something, and I have one button. That you will respond to it exactly as you would respond to a Flow approval today, either mobile app or on the portal or in actionable Outlook messages. But there's only one option, and it's just a proceed to move to the next step. Yes. I don't want the flow to keep kicking off a bunch of emails. If you want the other changes. Yeah, we don't have that today. We are working with SharePoint about how we could achieve that with item versions item versions to be able to detect only the changes we care about. Today, you will have to handle that in the Flow runs.
As a workaround, you can do some level of conditioning to say when it triggers, do a check. If the check happens, take action. If not, terminate.
Yeah, so I'm doing like another column, like a flag.
Yeah, not today. Yeah, like John mentioned, terminate is one of the, I think it's I called it the most underrated flow action ever.
Ooh.
Because it is super useful to be able to bail out of a flow run and not add additional complexity later. So as soon as you start checking conditions and multiple conditions, you end up with this like super wide, I told you I hated super wide flows earlier. Instead of trying to manage that, check a condition early. If the flow doesn't need to run, bail out, and then now you can continue after the yes, no, not within the yes box, but directly after it. It keeps everything narrow, and more importantly, it keeps everything simpler. We did have a slide, let me see if I can get back to it, on best practices. And these are the kind of, I translated best practices for programming into best practices for flow authoring. Renaming action cards and adding comments. We read flows so often, just like we read code very often. Comment your code, comment your flows, and rename your actions so that when you're picking outputs, maybe you have the same action used multiple times, you know exactly which one you're using the output from. And then very quickly, we'll get to your question in a second, don't touch production, work on copies of flows. People will have a flow running on a SharePoint list and start making changes on it and not necessarily realizing that they may have broken someone who was adding items to that list. Save a copy, make your changes there, and then apply them into the production flow. And similarly, prototyping with button triggers. Rather than waiting for items to change or forcing changes on a particular SharePoint list, throw down the button trigger, you can run it whenever you want, and you can focus on the rest of the logic. I could keep going all day on best practices there, but if you want to.
Apologies if you covered this in another session, but I believe all flows are attached to a user. So how do you ensure that if that user gets terminated, that all of these critical flows don't get essentially orphaned?
I can answer that one. So if it's a critical flow, one user should never own it, and that was a failure in the process to begin with, I think. So we have this idea of team flows, and so every flow that is mission critical should have additional owners added to it, so it becomes a team flow. Then that way, when the original owner leaves, their credentials die, one of those owners is able to quickly put their credentials in line and the flow can keep running. You can actually, through the flow management connector, you actually can monitor flow creation and you can do some level of additional ownership, like say add an admin. There's a lot of PowerShell things that you can do now to make that happen automatically. But I would say just like you're creating anything else in production, never have one owner. You could also add a service account. You would need it wouldn't be a true service account. It would be a user account that you provisioned as a worker account because it needs an actual license.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Thank you, guys.